Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live. Now that multiple versions of the vaccine are available, will employers mandate that employees get it before returning to work? We speak to a legal expert and an ethicist about the vaccine mandate conundrum. Plus, how Reddit users are upending Wall Street shorts. All that in our poll coming up. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's January 28th, and here's a quick look at the top headlines that are trending right now on LinkedIn. The U.S. economy shrank by 3.5% in 2020. Boeing lost $11.9 billion after record 2019, and Reddit users boost a slumping stock. Let's take a deeper look into that story. A message board on the online platform spurred its members to buy GameStop and AMC stock, sending shares soaring. The historic move came after major hedge funds shorted both stocks. Joining us now to discuss is Devin Banerjee, senior news editor for us here at LinkedIn. Devin, I know when my mom is pinging me about a story, you're pinging me about a story, and all my friends are pinging me that it's got to be big. But this stock has been moving around a lot this morning. So just tell us where GameStop stock is right now.
Yeah, absolutely, Caroline. Just 2 minutes ago, as you were doing the intro to the show, I got a text from a friend asking about this who has no experience in finance or investing. But yeah, let's just take a quick look at where it is today. The stock of GameStop is down 22% right now. This is after it had run up about 1,700% from January 1st to earlier this week.
Get off one, Nina. Well, in terms of what this story says, in terms of how big it is, I want to get your sense, because my mom was asking me this morning, actually, what is short selling? She has no sense as someone who is not on finance.
Yeah, very important concept to establish. And the stocks that are being targeted by these investors are stocks that have what's called a high short interest. So short selling, the intent of it is when investors want to make a financial bet on the decline of a stock. Typically, when someone goes long a stock, you're buying the stock hoping that it appreciates over time. When you go short a stock, you borrow it, you sell it, and then you buy it back, all with the intent of making money on the decline of that stock.
So we have these hedge funds shorting the stock, and then retail investors are actually going long on it, and they're having a big impact. This is kind of unheard of. What's happening here?
It really is unprecedented. As you said in your intro, Caroline, these investors are coming together online, in online forums, especially on Reddit, on a forum or what's called a subreddit called Wall Street Bets. This is typically a forum where folks come together to talk about investment ideas or what they're doing, but they are really, for reasons we'll get into, they are really coming together passionately and telling each other to plow into specific names, specific stocks like GameStop. And they're able to do this because they have the tools available to them. Over time, over the past few years, there are many more investment brokerages or platforms that you and I can jump on and trade stocks. You can do so for zero commission or no fees. And these are platforms like Robinhood. And so these folks are coming together and doing this right now.
And I know we're early days on this, but why did they do it? Obviously to make some money, but I've seen some articles that are saying that it could be bigger than just that.
There are a lot of psychological underpinnings here. And really what it comes down to, I think, is this anti-establishment feeling. These folks have realized that they can take on the big guys in finance, the hedge fund billionaires, the titans who these Redditors believe have always benefited from the system. They reap a lot of fees, a lot of profits from the system in their activities. And these Redditors believe that they can take them on. It's kind of a rehash of Occupy Wall Street about a decade ago. But I'm seeing a lot of folks say it's Occupy Wall Street with a bite, with the ability to incur some financial pain on these folks in Wall Street. And I should note, they're being egged on by anti-establishment heroes of theirs, folks like Elon Musk or the investor Chamath Palihapitiya, or even Mark Cuban, who chimed in yesterday saying he believes this is a positive trend, that individual investors can rise up and influence the market.
Well, Devin, to say that these stocks are volatile from those graphs we just saw is also an understatement. How are these brokerage firms responding?
Yeah, absolutely. Just in the past few hours this morning, Caroline, most brokerages have stepped in and placed some limitations on trading in these stocks. That ranges from blocking users from taking new positions, whether long positions or options positions in these stocks, to some other brokerages just limiting options trading, for example. But that has happened overnight and earlier this morning. That's probably the biggest driver of the stock decline that I mentioned at the top of the segment. GameStop now down about 15%. And some folks are saying that this may be also behind the scenes conversations with regulators, with these brokerages, encouraging them to take these actions.
Yeah, I'm sure regulators are super concerned right now. What are we hearing from them?
So we are hearing that they are concerned. In fact, yesterday, the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that the entire administration's economic team, as well as the new Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, are watching this closely. The SEC said it is, quote, actively monitoring this volatility. So those are the public statements, saying that there is concern and that they're actively monitoring it. The story that I think will come out today and the rest of this week is what those behind the scenes conversations with brokerages have been that may be the driver behind why some of those brokerages took these actions, because their users are not happy about that. I mean, Robinhood, for example, set out to democratize financial services. It wanted everyone to be able to trade, and now it is placing limitations on trading. So there may be behind the scenes conversations with regulators.
So Devin, let's get out a crystal ball here. Are we going to see more of this? Retail investors trying to prove they're just as important as the hedge funds, or are we going to be able to stamp this out in some way?
I think there are two big trends coming together, Caroline. The first is that elimination of commissions that has happened over the past couple of years. Trading is now basically frictionless. It's free. Anyone can jump on their phone, open the app, and trade. So I think that will continue to drive these so-called retail or individual investors higher in their influence. Also, it's important to note, just over the past 10, 11 months, a lot of these folks, these traders who are on Reddit and talking about taking these actions, are sitting at home, like you and I am. But they're sitting at home. They may have built up some money. They may have received some stimulus checks. They may be just bored and sitting at home. Right now, you have these two drivers coming together, and that confluence is really making this not so surprising when you think about it.
Well, Devin, I have a lot of concerns about this, but my number one concern as a news person is that GameStop stock, one of the hardest things I've ever had to say on air, remains in the headlines. So I hope that I don't have to talk to you about this for some time, but we'll keep you updated. Devin, thanks for joining us on the show.
Absolutely.
All right, that was Devin Banerjee, senior news editor for us here at LinkedIn. And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. We've been polling professionals on the LinkedIn news page, and we want to hear from you too on the poll that we have for you in the stream. Should employees be required to take a COVID-19 vaccine before returning to the office? A, yes, B, no, or C, it depends. Let us know in the stream, and we'll have a conversation about that on today's show. That brings us to the main topic of discussion that we have for you. As the rollout of the coronavirus vaccine continues to ramp up, companies are having to think and answer critical questions about how they are going to get employees back to work safely. One method may mean incentivizing workers to get vaccinated, but what about mandating workers to get the shot before coming back to the office? Is that legal? Is that ethical? Joining us now to discuss is Diana Tutzik, a partner at Gilson Dobb, and Stanford ethicist Susan Leotode. Diana, Susan, thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you for having us.
All right, Diana, I come from a family of lawyers, so let's talk law first.
Right.
There's been a lot of miscommunication about this on LinkedIn. Is it legal for employers to mandate that their employees get the vaccine before returning back to the office?
Unfortunately, there's not a ton of information out yet. The EEOC has provided guidelines, which leads us to believe that it is legal, but it's going to be incredibly challenging for them to roll it out. And of course, if it's mandated, where do we stand with respect to liability from any adverse reaction there too?
And Susan, as you think about this from an ethical perspective, what should the EEOC, what should governing bodies keep in mind as they're thinking about whether this should be something that legally companies can do?
Well, there are a number of ethical questions. I'll start with the most fundamental one, which is that the ethics should always be tethered to the science. And the problem is that right now we have some unknowns that are critically important to balancing the ethical questions. One is that we don't know whether the vaccine protects against transmission. A second is we don't know what the long-term consequences of the vaccine are because we're still in this emergency use permit phase. And a third is we don't know what the vaccine's capability is in terms of protecting against current mutations and potential future mutations. And similarly, on the side of the disease, we don't know the long-term trajectory of COVID, and we don't know how treatments are going to evolve. So this question, particularly in terms of decisions that corporate leadership will make, really needs to stay tethered to the science and follow and monitor the science as it evolves.
Susan and Diana, I'm going to go ahead and say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream. We have Mason from Texas, Pavan from India, Desiree from Colorado, Leslie from Florida, and Ludo from Belgium. Thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live. Diana, Susan's last response, it was filled with a lot of "we don't know," but people are asking the law to figure this out right now. So in this period of uncertainty where there is a lot of stuff that is unknown, how can we move forward with the legality of all of this?
It's incredibly challenging. I have never said maybe and possibly as much as I have in my legal career in the last couple of months or so since the whole COVID pandemic. We can only go off what we know, and there's case law with respect to the flu vaccine, and employers do have the right to, particularly providers and hospitals have the right to mandate that their employees get the flu vaccine. So we've never been in a time like this. I know the word unprecedented is used and overused, but this is indeed an unprecedented time. So I think that employers have to be incredibly careful, just incredibly careful with respect to mandating anything. I imagine that the first type of employer that's going to mandate anything is going to be the hospital, the healthcare provider. Beyond that, any questions I've received, I would advise my clients, my corporate clients, definitely to hold off any kind of mandatory vaccination until we get more information.
I'm seeing more members joining us in the stream. So if you're just joining us, I am here. We're having a conversation about the ethics and also the legality of mandating vaccines. So if you have questions for our guests, be sure and drop them in the stream right now, and then we'll get them answered for you on today's show. Susan, when we think about the ethics of this, something that's been top of mind for me is like, okay, let's say a company says you can work from home if you don't want to take the vaccine and not return to work, but that probably will curb your career if you don't have that face time with your team anymore when everyone's back in the office. How should managers, how should corporate leaders think about that?
So your question raises the big issue about how do you enforce this? Because at the end of the day, mandated vaccines doesn't mean we're going to force everyone to have a vaccine. It means that we're going to up the ante on incentives. So how are we going to enforce, assuming that some companies will put in place a mandatory system? Will people be fired? And what about the inequality of that in a very, very difficult economy? Will some people be allowed to work from home, which could have career consequences, but again, could have real inequality consequences for those who are not able to work from home? Will it be positive incentives, like raising salary? I saw in the news today that there was a company suggesting raising wages by $1 an hour. There are other incentives like corporate perks. You're only allowed to travel if you're vaccinated, or you're only allowed to use the corporate cafeteria if you're vaccinated. So I think getting the enforcement clear is, first of all, an incredibly important part of the ethics, eliminating arbitrariness from the system, but also being mindful of the fact that as some of these enforcement mechanisms are applied, they can create further ethical dilemmas and in particular, real inequality.
We have a comment here in the stream from Kathleen. She believes businesses should make sure that their employees are vaccinated, and anyone else who works at home or others should make their own decisions. Kathleen, thanks for bringing that perspective into the show. Diana, you represent employers on this issue. I don't envy you for that. Talk to us about some of the liabilities here. What if an employee gets injured and somehow it's vaccine related?
That is a very, very real possibility. Unfortunately, in California, as you know, is fairly litigious. So there's the added bonus of that. We have laws on the books, or case law rather, on the books that say that if any kind of vaccination is received, inoculation is received for the employer's benefit, certainly the employers are going to be liable. This brings into question, what type of employer are we talking about? Are we talking about a hospital that administers its own vaccines, or are we talking about a corporation that provides the vaccination at the corporate site or sends its employees to a hospital or a clinic to receive vaccination? I would say the overarching belief in the defense community is that the employer is liable short of basically just providing information. If you simply provide information about where one can get the vaccine, that's probably as close as you can come to not being liable. Anything else, when you're doing it for the employer's benefit, if there's any kind of causal connection that it's related to your employment, the employer will be liable for any kind of adverse effect from the vaccination.
And Susan, Diana just spoke to the legal side of this conundrum, but I'm curious as an ethicist what you think about this in terms of what companies should keep in mind. Of course, corporations, managers, they just want to keep employees safe, but there is a flip side to this, a potential flip side.
So corporations definitely have health and safety as one of their top ethical principles. And it's particularly tricky because they want to keep employees safe, but they also want to keep their clients safe, the passengers on airplanes, or as Diana said, and I completely agree with Diana's comment that hospitals are likely to be among the first to implement this kind of policy. They want to keep their patients safe. They want to keep customers in stores safe. So it's a very big and complex responsibility. Typically, though, mandatory vaccinations, including if we look at things, for example, the measles, have certain very specific exemptions. And again, this goes back to properly defining enforcement. But for example, with measles, typically the exemptions would be for individual medical reasons why the vaccine might be risky, and with doctor supervision, or something like religious exemptions. So we'd have to figure out also how we manage those. But at the moment, as I said, part of the problem is that this question, in my view, for companies is a bit premature to answer because we don't have the science in the same way that we have decades of research on polio and smallpox and measles vaccines. So it's not to say that we need to wait decades, but it's very difficult for companies to assess the liability risk and assess the potential impact when we don't have the science and we don't have any sort of duration of experience.
Stephanie is actually joining us in the stream right now, bringing in a critical point of this topic that we haven't discussed, which is religion. She says employers need to respect people's religious and personal beliefs in making their decisions on whether to mandate vaccinations. Diana, when religion comes into this, what happens with the law in terms of creating policies around this?
Well, there are exceptions to any kind of mandatory vaccination, of course, and religion is one of them. One is disability being the other, of course. So if there's a sincerely held religious belief that justifies why the employee is not able to get the vaccine or refuses to get the vaccine, there's certainly an exception for that. So that does come into play.
I'm seeing another question in the stream right now from Rosa. She's asking, if you give special incentives to vaccinated employees and not others, isn't there a risk of discrimination from a legal perspective? Diana, why don't you take that one on, and then we'll flip over to Susan.
Absolutely, there's a risk of discrimination. There's so many incredible risks associated with this vaccine mandatory, or even if it's just mildly encouraged. Again, if there's any kind of business interest, if it helps the business at all, there's going to be all sorts of liabilities that stem, and certainly discrimination is one of them.
And Susan, you just wrote a book about these complicated decisions that corporations are having to make right now around ethics. Discrimination has to come into play in that.
Absolutely, discrimination comes into play. All kinds of inequality can come into play in the decision whether or not to have the mandatory vaccinations. And as I said, in sort of what the enforcement would be, it's very, very important. And if we look even more broadly for a moment at multinational corporations, we have situations where they may have subsidiaries in places like Africa where nobody is getting vaccinated because there are no vaccine supplies. And already even in the West, we need to keep in mind that there's a very real practical problem here. And, as the book suggests, ethics really needs to be grounded in reality. We simply don't have the supplies or the distribution capability to vaccinate employees now. So even the most well-meaning or enthusiastic employees, by and large, are not able to access vaccines. And in particular, because in most places that I've seen, it's 65 and above, assuming that population can get vaccines. But that's not the population that is the workforce, by and large.
And Susan and Diana, the reason I wanted to have you on together on the show is because I wanted to hear what you think of the other side of this. Diana, I'll start with you. In your mind, what is the biggest ethical issue? And then I'll pose the same question to Susan.
I tend to agree with Susan. I think there's so many landmines here. Again, the way that it's being distributed, the rollout, there's so many issues with that. I know that we just pivoted slightly. I believe it was on the January 22nd in California, where we are now vaccinating 65 and older more readily, and people in long-term care residential facilities. So inevitably with something like this, there's going to be all sorts of ethical concerns. It's inevitable. I just don't see how we can get away from it, because there's going to be populations that are going to be more resistant to it. And how do we get them to agree to the vaccine and agree that it's good for them when there's history on the other side that says that maybe they've been taken advantage of before? I see so many issues with rolling it out and getting it to the people that actually need it. And then obviously you have the discrepancy between the poorer countries and the richer countries. So it's, yeah, I'm glad I'm not in charge of that. I can tell you.
It certainly expands beyond
Yeah.
the employer issues.
Absolutely.
Susan, I know you have a legal background, but didn't want to speak to the legality of this, but I'm just curious, as you're hearing Diana talk, what's going to keep you up tonight?
I mean, the problem with this issue is that, as Diana said, it's not only unprecedented, but it's entangled with all of the other issues that the company faces, because it is health and safety of both employees and the public. It's a public health matter. But then we also link up to many of the other social science issues. We have economic issues. We have political issues. We have behavioral psychology issues. You know, we have a very significant mental health component. And I'll keep coming back to inequality, because there are just so many different ways in which inequality factors into the decision-making around this. And the most well-meaning corporate leadership is indeed navigating a minefield. And what I would just say is that one of the ways through this is to assure that we're not looking at it just as a binary question. Do we have mandatory or not? But rather to say, what are all the different ways, all the different tools that we need to use in order to tackle the safety issues? And because this vaccine isn't currently proven to prevent transmission, we are still very much in a world of wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands, and the like. And so I think the best way through this is just to be as careful as possible, and for companies and leaders to make sure that they apply every tool that they have wherever they have them.
Well, Diana and Susan, I said this at the top of the show, but I don't envy the position that either your experts are in terms of advising companies on these issues, but I do appreciate you bringing those insights onto LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right, that was Diana Tutzik, a partner at Gilson Daub, as well as Susan Leotold. She's a Stanford ethicist. I want to thank them both for joining us on today's show. Let's bring back the poll results. I'm curious to see them. What are you guys thinking in the stream right now in terms of, should employees be required to take a COVID-19 vaccine before returning to the office? 59% of you said no, that's the majority. We have 33% coming in with a yes, and then 9% are saying that it depends. So thanks for joining us on the show and for your votes. This is LinkedIn News Live. Tomorrow, you can join us at 12 Eastern for a conversation led by my colleague, Andrew Seaman. He's going to be speaking with the founder of Talent Paradigm about how to get your resume noticed. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.